Heaven or Hell Duel 1, let's rock!
In Games, Agency as Art, philosopher Thi Nguyen argues for the existence and benefits of what he calls aesthetic striving play. That is, the playing of games for the purpose of engaging in a struggle, followed by the aesthetic examination of that struggle after the fact. In simpler terms, in aesthetic striving play, the point of games isn't to win at them, but to try to win at them. Then, afterward, we reflect on the mentality the game's rules put us in, and what we did to achieve that win. What Nguyen calls the agential mode, and what that mode communicates to us. For example, to succeed at chess requires predictive imagination. We have to be able to think several steps ahead and imagine the state of the board based on various different possible movements of the pieces, then find which one is the most beneficial for us. Chess asks us to enter an agential mode of imagination, calculation, prediction, and counterplay. The winner is, in most cases where both players are playing to win, the one who better understands and embodies those traits. We strive to win, and in our attempt to do so, we enter that mode and make practical, instrumental choices using that mode. Then, when the pieces are put away, we reflect on the beauty and value of that struggle, as created by the game's rules. Finally, we carry that mode with us into other games, and into the rest of our lives, as an eternal resource in our growing mental library. For my own example, let's take Bayonetta. The central mechanic of Bayonetta is dodge offset, which allows the player to maintain attack strings and continue dealing damage while using iframe dodges to weave through enemy offense. The most damaging parts of Bayonetta's combos are the streams of bullets from held attack inputs, and the wicked weaves that come at the end of strings, and both contribute significantly to the score counter. The former by racking up points, and the latter by resetting the gradually decaying point value of attacks. The strongest combos are necessarily the longest and therefore most dangerous ones, both in terms of the number of punches and kicks necessary to complete them and get out their wicked weaves, but also because maximizing the damage and score of each punch or kick requires holding the input for the bullet stream. Hitting a single high-value combo will almost always require, at absolute minimum, one dodge offset, usually more. Playing for high ranks is incentivized and based on three factors: combo score, time to complete fights, and damage taken. Techniques which score the most combo tend to be slower, making them compete directly with time, and taking any damage whatsoever results in an imperfect damage rank, so the balance between flashiness and efficiency must be made under the pressure of remaining completely untouched. All three factors must receive platinum medals in order to get a pure platinum in a fight. All fights in a mission must be pure platinumed in order for the mission itself to be ranked a pure platinum, and all missions must be pure platinumed in order to pure platinum an entire difficulty. Defense, offense, and rank chasing are all woven together through dodge offset. This gives the game a feeling distinct from other action games. Whereas Devil May Cry emphasizes locking opponents into hit, stun, and juggle states for free-form, expressive combos, and shmups emphasize memorization and level routing, Bayonetta is about the weaving together of offense and defense. It wants you constantly engaging with enemies who come at you fast and are hard to stagger or launch, passing through their attacks and counterattacking at the same time. It wants you to milk every point of damage and score you can out of your combos, pushing your luck to the absolute last moment before a dodge which preserves your momentum. Complemented by the presentation and cinematics, as well as the title character's personality and body language, the game's agential mode becomes clear. Bayonetta is a game about elegance and dance. It teaches us to do many things at once, with grace, under immense pressure, and we can witness and appreciate our own elegant maneuvers within that pressure, maybe even making ourselves a little more elegant in the process. The game truly makes you feel like Bayonetta. This type of agency is what separates games from other artistic mediums. Other art forms want to put the audience into a certain mindset and make them think and feel certain things, yes, but the audience is generally not an agent in the art. There's no input required on their part. The movie plays whether you're watching and interpreting it or not. You might be tempted to point to performing arts, like live music or theater, but these are distinct from games. As Andrew Kania points out in his article, Why Gamers Are Not Performers, games are not art to be performed. Certainly one can perform a game, as in the case of a live speedrun in front of an audience, but that doesn't make them art to be performed any more than, say, a live reading of The Great Gatsby makes novels art to be performed. Some games might be built for performance, but those are exceptions, not the rule. Performers also generally don't discover the meaning of a work as they perform it. They learn their lines, piece together a meaning from the text that they intend to convey to an audience, and then convey that meaning through performance. They are a part of the art, not witness to it. There are participatory art pieces, ones which ask an audience to come up on stage and do something they haven't been prepared for, but these aren't too common, and they're not performances. An artist can also serve as their own audience, but again, this is the exception. You can write a letter to yourself, but most letters are written to others. Games are messages we receive from artists who are attempting to communicate to us, and we explore their meaning through instrumental play. I don't communicate the idea of dance to myself by playing Bayonetta. I'm taught that idea by the rules, obstacles, and goals of the game that I have to figure out how to act in accordance with in order to win. I learn its agential mode. If I enjoy a game, it's likely because the agential mode produces some sense of harmony. This might take the form of a series of seemingly perfect plays under high pressure, as if orchestrated beforehand, even if they're far more serendipitous than that. A flawlessly placed heavy attack that disrupts multiple enemies at once right before they hit me, maintaining my hitless run while maximizing damage output and setting up further offense. Or a quick sequence of mix-ups on my opponent that demonstrates a strong understanding of how my tools can exploit their defensive tendencies, even if only for a brief moment. If I dislike a game, then there's likely some kind of disharmony. The intended mode is unpleasant to inhabit. It might require tedious execution of the same dull task over and over again, or the rules themselves might be poorly built to convey the intended mode. The intended rules themselves might be great, so long as the audience plays along, but be chock full of exploits that create a far more efficient, but far less enjoyable mode, which forces the player to choose between playing well or having fun. The player must care about winning in order to strive, which is the entire point, so the desire to win will usually take precedence over enjoyment, unfortunately. The craft of creating a good game, or at least a game of this type, is in encouraging the right agential mode for harmonious, aesthetic-striving play. Note that said craft can fail both if the rules feel arbitrarily difficult to comply with, or if they're so lax as to encourage no particular mode at all. There must be a delicate balance between guiding the player down the right path and allowing them to act of their own volition. There must necessarily be a gap between what the player should do and what they can do. As Nguyen puts it, the art of games is the medium of agency. This is where I think much of the discourse surrounding video games gets tripped up, because this agency makes games distinct from most things we commonly understand as art forms. Sports are art, as are traditional tabletop games, but we rarely think of them as such. And so our touchstone for understanding video games as art goes underexamined. Chess is art, and Guilty Gear is art, and they're art for very similar reasons, yet rarely are they spoken of in similar ways. Not helpful to the matter is that video games usually do contain some kind of traditional narrative or audiovisual experience, so we can easily be fooled into thinking games are simply a form of fiction, or a museum for beautiful visuals and music that happens to involve gameplay so as to enhance those things. Unapt comparisons between games and other mediums abound. A quick and dirty tweet here or there probably isn't much harm, but entire articles and videos premising themselves on comparisons to film or literature are. I can skip chapters in a book, why can't I skip levels in a video game? Is an absurd question that no serious games writer could pose as a silver bullet without seeing the issue, but it's an easy way to communicate a belief. And if there's anything I've learned from games, or from making videos about games, it's that resorting to the easy way out has a tendency to snowball. We're at a point where the public at large needs to find a consensus on how to view games, and I think Nguyen offers a strong perspective. We play games to struggle, and to reflect on that struggle. That's not the only thing we play them for, but it is their unique appeal. Games are not films. They aren't novels, and they aren't music, either listened to or performed. And they especially are not toys, though toys can be used to play games, and many games require toys to be played properly. Games are sets of rules, goals, and obstacles designed to push the player into certain behaviors and mindsets. More simply, according to Bernard Suits, playing a game is the voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. That definition is up for debate. Nguyen cites examples of games he thinks fall outside of it, but it's a useful definition for his and our purposes. Importantly, this is not a dismissal of less mechanically complex or intensive games. Much of Nguyen's book centers on simplistic social games, or even what he calls stupid games, wherein much of the joy is in inevitably failing despite genuinely trying to win, like Twister or Telephone, which have something of an equivalent in popular online multiplayer games like Lethal Company. One of my favorite games is Yume Nikki, another is Night in the Woods, and I've positively reviewed a number of story-centric games. Some games can lean more toward being interactive fiction, or an interesting space to inhabit, and that's fine. It's the idea that games as a whole should lean that direction that I take issue with. On the other hand, Disco Elysium is not any less a video game for being narrative-heavy and easy to complete. That's too simplistic a way of seeing things. It's still largely a Suitsian game. Disco Elysium has rules, goals, and obstacles the same as any other game does. That doesn't change just because there's an unusually high amount of reading in it. Some would call Nguyen or Suits' view of games reductive and limiting, but in fact, it's the idea that Disco Elysium is somehow fundamentally different from all other games before it that's reductive. DE was developed by tabletop nerds, and it's crammed full of dice rolls, stats, equipment, healing items, buffs and debuffs, perks, and so on. It's easily comparable to tabletop adaptations like Planescape Torment, or adventure games like Sam & Max. The notion that this gamey-ass game is somehow high above and an insult to the exact games it was inspired by, simply because it doesn't have combat mechanics, or rather, because it doesn't frame its mechanics through the lens of combat, is close-minded. As if to say that rolling dice to win a speech check is somehow more intellectual than rolling dice to hit a kobold for 1d8 plus 2 damage, purely based on framing. Framing does inform the agential mode, but it doesn't make rolling dice not a game. Disco Elysium is just a well-written RPG adventure game. You don't have to pretend it's something else just because you've never played a game with good writing before. Little anecdote, I remember reviewing Octopath Traveler, a game I praised for its combat but criticized for its story and structure. I recommended anyone who picks the game up to consider skipping the cutscenes and focusing on the gameplay. And I got at least one aghast comment which said, essentially, why would you tell someone to skip the story in an RPG? The story's the whole point, dumbass. Which I think is, in miniature, demonstrative of the issue. This person was wrong, and wrong in such a way that it's clear they don't even really believe the thing they said. No one would choose to play the world's worst visual novel where the important parts are sandwiched between tens of hours of near-contextless combat. We wouldn't have an entire genre of arcane spreadsheet stat systems if the story were all anyone wanted. Persona 5 would be an anime with cheap tie-in games, not a game with a cheap tie-in anime. And yet, the idea that we primarily or even only play RPGs for the story persists, because they tend to have a significant amount of story in them. Once more than 10% of your game is narrative, suddenly the narrative is the only important part, apparently. Because that's the respectable art form, right? While I'm at it, Silent Hill is a traditionally fun survival horror adventure game. Please stop talking about it as if it has the worst gameplay of all time just because the combat is deliberately simplistic. Oh, did I say Silent Hill? I meant Pathologic. Anyway, to present Disco Elysium as somehow discontinuous from Baldur's Gate and Monkey Island comes not from intellectualism, but from insecurity. As Nguyen says, quote, more significant worry is that Suitsian play is necessarily immature and unworthy of serious attention. Suitsian games always involve practical struggles. We become absorbed in the instrumental activity of overcoming obstacles and achieving seemingly arbitrary goals, and it is precisely these aspects that can make game playing seem like a lesser activity, end quote. He cites critics whose examples of art in video games are things like McDonald's Video Game, for its commentary on capitalism as opposed to environmentalism, or September 12th, which I think you can guess the subject matter of. According to these critics, games become art when they can do serious art things, like discuss politics through framing and game mechanics. More from Nguyen, quote, underneath all these approaches seems to be the presumption that Suitsian play, the play of skills and clearly defined goals, cannot be valuable in any really deep or fulfilling way. These accounts seem motivated by the need to find some other footing from which to establish the value of games." End quote. I'll do the unprofessional thing Nguyen is getting at here and say the other footing in question is pretentious nonsense. If you're incapable of understanding or explaining why Tetris or Balatro is art, and not just art in the way dumb fun action movies are art, but in the way you actually respect, then you're not fit to be a games critic. Bad criticism centers itself on audio visuals and storytelling because its author is incapable of perceiving depth in practical struggle alone. Asking why more video games don't have serious political stories is like asking why NBA games don't comment on world events. And mind you, basketball does have politics in it. Loads of it. As do all video games, and all sports for that matter. Go watch some John Boy's videos. But what these people want is a brutish, unsubtle politics that they can access easily and stroke their beards over. Not substance. The exact same mainstream critical sphere that begs for artistic legitimacy also rejected Rainworld, an unquestionably more mature game than most, because it expected them to match that maturity, and dared to express its themes primarily through the instrumental play unique to the medium, rather than cutscenes. Yes, my fellow internet communists, this is primarily because of material conditions. Please stop reminding me. I already know. We'll get to that later in another video. We treat the old God of War as an embarrassing representative of its more childish time, and prop up the new God of War as finally being grown up, when the new God of War is actually its own equally, if not more embarrassing representative of our current, sophomoric, grasping at legitimacy era, an era which will age far, far worse than its predecessors. From Roger Ebert's 1997 review of Gamera, Guardians of the Universe, and this one you might have heard before, quote, "There's a learning process that moviegoers go through. They begin in childhood without sophistication or much taste, and, for example, like Gamera more than Air Force One, because flying turtles are obviously more entertaining than United States presidents. Then they grow older and develop taste, and prefer Air Force One, which is better made and has big stars and a more plausible plot. Isn't it more believable, after all, that a president could single-handedly wipe out a plane load of terrorists than that a giant turtle could spit gobs of flame? Then, if they continue to grow older and wiser, they complete the circle and return to Gamera again, realizing that while both movies are preposterous, the turtle movie has the charm of utter goofiness, and in an age of flawless special effects, it is somehow more fun to watch flawed ones. Video games are currently in their Air Force One phase, and have been for well over a decade now. Kratos is still juggling zombies and chopping up hydras in shallow but cathartic beat-em-up gameplay, aimed squarely at the satisfaction of teenage boys, yet his game now carries itself with a certain self-seriousness designed to tell you that, yes, the President of the United States can in fact take out a plane load of terrorists. The type of game for those who never did grow older and wiser and complete the circle. The Last of Us games feature multiplayer deathmatch and roguelike horde survival modes, which use the exact same shooting and survival mechanics as the campaigns about the horror and inhumanity of violence. Also, Zionism. The medium, and especially its critical sphere, is awash in hollow sentiment. Mind you, I don't mean either of these games shouldn't have enjoyable combat, though that might be an interesting angle. I mean that the combat constitutes the bulk of the substance, given it's the agential part of this agential medium, yet the narratives seem actively ashamed of having to accompany it. Air Force One says a lot about the country that made it, just not in the ways it meant to. Even Ebert, famed video games will never be art believer, conceded chess was art. Maybe that's because he was an old fogey who inherited the cultural cachet of chess as a thinking man's game, but maybe we should have shown him the neutral game in Street Fighter, a digital analog to chess which leverages the unique qualities of video games, instead of Flower. Maybe the only reason we didn't do that, in spite of its obviousness, was an internalized insecurity over the supposed childishness of fighting games and the aesthetics of magical martial arts battles. Maybe we need to accept that Shadow of the Colossus is art because it's a boss fight puzzle game, not in spite of that. Which unfortunately forces us to give up the orthodoxy of Shadow of the Colossus as a peak of the medium, solely on the basis of its story and presentation, and genuinely reckon with whether or not it's as good a game as others like it. I think it is, but I didn't reach that conclusion by watching its cutscenes and navel-gazing over its visuals. We're preoccupied with compelling prose and audiovisual beauty, so-called artfulness, things other mediums provide just as well if not better, with the inevitable implication that the superior game developer would be some other form of artist who deigns to make us something in their spare time, with as little influence from the medium itself as possible. We think we can convince our skeptical family members of the value of games if we point to a beautiful image or a sentimental message and go, "Look, art, like in movies." When your mom sees you playing Ninja Gaiden Black, it's understandably difficult to explain how the latex-clad shinobi chopping up army men with a katana is actually very deep and mature art. It would be difficult for me, even armed with the concepts of striving play and agential modes, to explain to someone who's hardly ever touched a video game, or who has bad notions about their value in their head, how nuanced it is to use Izuna Drop. Not just for its direct damage and area of effect, but also for its ability to isolate Ryu and its target in the air and avoid oncoming attacks, and yada yada yada. It's hard to explain how much patience and forethought it takes to quickly weigh up whether you should use that magical glowing blue orb to heal, or to access a near-instant level 2 heavy sword charge combo. It's hard to accept, even amongst ourselves, that Ninja Gaiden Black, the game, is art. Higher art, even, than most games playing at art that currently exist. It's an understandable mistake to make, but the point of understanding a mistake is to correct it. And what I can tell you is that a comparison to sports is far, far more effective than a comparison to film. I can tell you that Roger Ebert would not have had many kind words to say about BioShock Infinite. He called a flower a postcard, and he was right. Once more from Nguyen, quote, "We can find the aesthetics of agency in virtually any game. It is not confined to narrative cinematic video games, or politically serious game design. It is a kind of aesthetic experience common to sports, video games, board games, role-playing games, card games, and more. The general neglect for the aesthetics of agency arises, I suspect, from a certain anxiety about the value of goal-oriented play. As long as the goals of a game seem so arbitrary, pursuing them so vehemently seems childish. Thus, in many of the recent attempts to raise the cultural status of games, writers have sought to find other aspects to praise than mere instrumental, goal-oriented play. The seriousness and importance of fiction and social critique are well established. If we can show that games can and do function as a form of fiction, cinema, or modern art, then the status of games as art, and thus their cultural worth, can be secured." End quote. We need a change in perspective. We need to stop looking outward for affirmation and start looking within. Rather than treat video games as a nascent medium in need of guidance and bolstering from outside itself, we should understand them as contiguous with games as a whole, which have been with humanity since before recorded history. We've been playing games far longer than we've been watching films or writing novels. Play is a behavior so core that it goes beyond human nature. It's animal nature. Play is a formative and necessary part of any sentient creature's development. And dice are about 5,000 years old. Baldur's Gate 3 and Disco Elysium are using mechanics that are about as old and reliable as the wheel, which they notably did not feel the need to reinvent, regardless of anyone claiming they did. It may have taken a few millennia, but games are finally getting their due, and we shouldn't cheapen that at such a critical juncture. This conversation itself is dated. We had it with Ebert and seemingly learned nothing. And here I am, making more refined versions of arguments I was hearing nearly a decade ago. We need to turn away from lazy, pseudo-intellectual desires, which tell us that the value of games is found in the familiar fields of storytelling and audiovisual design, or that all this mechanical gameplay stuff is just a fun toy to play with in between the important parts. And that includes the idea that gameplay exists to serve the story, which is precisely backwards. I also reject, wholeheartedly, the idea that one can be a fan of a game they've only ever watched others play. How convenient it would be if we didn't have to learn anything new to be able to understand and appreciate games. If only we could declare the most artful and deep games to be the ones most similar to things we already like. What this would actually mean is that almost all video games, for the first few decades of gaming's existence, are bereft of meaning and not worthy of study. Entire genres would be laid to waste. All those great works in the canon of gaming history rendered irrelevant and childish in a single wave of the hand. Fun toys, but not the sort of thing adults bother with. Convenient if you want to call yourself an expert without playing anything made before, say, the turn of the century, I suppose. Convenient, but facile. Pseudo-intellectualism is, in truth, anti-intellectualism, masquerading as its opposite. And it would have you believe that agency, the one thing inherent to games, is what's holding them back. One last quote from Nguyen to close us out. The aesthetics of agency offers a way to explain the distinctive aesthetic value of games. Without such an account, we will be inclined to cash out the aesthetic value of games in terms of some other, more established form of aesthetic value. But this assimilation threatens to obscure the unique potential of games as an art form. This has happened before in other emerging art forms. Take, for example, the beginnings of art photography. In the early days of photography, the very clarity, crispness, and detail afforded by the technology seemed, to many, uncomfortable. Photography was starkly unlike the nearest available art form, painting. Early photographers who aimed self-consciously at making photography an art form often engaged in various manipulations to undo that clarity, like blurring and soft focus. Their goal was to make photographs more closely resemble traditional painting. It took the rejection of the traditional painting paradigm for photography to begin to explore some of the artistic potential special to the medium. I'm certainly not claiming here that an art form must confine itself to those effects unique to its medium. I am only claiming that we can obscure a new medium's artistic potential when we bid for its art status by trying too desperately to assimilate it within a more traditional art form. Hi everyone, thanks for watching. This is the first in a series of shorter videos which are going to be using Nguyen's ideas of striving play and agential modes as their basis. I'll be referencing agency as art a lot, and as always, reference is no substitute for direct experience. I recommend you check out the book for yourself if you're interested. It's more directly insightful than anything I'm going to say. But I'll be extrapolating on his ideas across a variety of subjects. Video games, of course, come up throughout the book, but the book is about games broadly, not just of the video variety. So much of it is also about rock climbing and racquetball. So I get to bastardize his ideas and use them to complain about other people's opinions on video games. This first video is admittedly kind of basic. I'm just laying the groundwork so the things I say going forward make sense. A number of the more interesting topics are laced throughout this video script in truncated form, so they can be paid off later. Hopefully I can get this little series out quickly. I think I've worked out most of what I want to say. It's just a matter of salvaging it out of a scrapped video that spawned this one. But I'm extremely irresponsible and unreliable, so no promises. See you in the next one, I guess.